10 years ago, standing at the edge of a river that looked no different from thousands of others around the world, Jeremy Wade carried a list in his head that very few people knew about. It was not a list meant for television executives or marketing teams. It was a private reckoning, a mental catalog of mysteries whispered by fishermen, villagers, and survivors who had watched the water take something from them. At the time, he never believed that list would be finished. Not because of ambition, but because rivers have a way of keeping their secrets, and because every answer extracted from them comes at a cost. To millions of viewers, River Monsters felt like pure adventure. Each episode promised danger, discovery, and the thrill of confronting something enormous and unseen. A calm man with a British accent would arrive in a remote place, listen carefully, then enter the water with quiet confidence. The formula was simple, reassuring, almost ritualistic. But beneath that familiar rhythm, another story was unfolding, one far less comforting and far more fragile than the legends being investigated on screen. From the outside, success came quickly. The show became one of the most watched programs on its network, praised for blending science, folklore, and raw exploration without resorting to cheap sensationalism. Jeremy Wade was not portrayed as a conqueror of nature, but as a witness. That distinction mattered to him deeply. He had spent decades before television as a biologist and traveler, documenting stories that most people dismissed as exaggeration. River Monsters was never meant to glorify fear. It was meant to explain it. Yet explanation has consequences. Every expedition demanded more than curiosity. It demanded endurance, patience, and an acceptance of risk that most people never experience in their daily lives. Long before the cameras rolled, Wade had already learned how unforgiving remote rivers could be. Illness, isolation, and exhaustion were familiar companions. What television added was scale. More locations, more pressure, more expectation that each journey would be more dramatic than the last. There were days when nothing happened, when the water remained stubbornly silent. Those days did not make it into the final cut. What viewers saw were carefully shaped narratives, built from weeks of uncertainty and waiting. What they did not see were the nights spent listening to rain hammer tin roofs, the mornings when bodies felt heavier than the equipment they carried, or the quiet calculations about whether the risk was still worth it. The calm presence on screen was real, but it was also a discipline, one that required constant control over fear and fatigue. As the years passed, something else began to change. The rivers themselves no longer felt the same. Places once described with all were returning different impressions. The water looked murkier. Fish were harder to find. Stories from locals shifted subtly, from warnings about monsters to laments about what used to be there. These were not things easily captured in a single episode. They did not fit neatly into a structure built around mystery and resolution. But they stayed with Wade, accumulating quietly, like notes written in the margins of a story that was no longer as clear as it once was. Publicly, River Monsters appeared unstoppable. Privately, the strain was becoming harder to ignore. The work demanded constant travel across continents, abrupt shifts in climate, and long stretches without rest. The physical danger was obvious, but the emotional weight was slower, more insidious. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from repeatedly placing yourself in situations where mistakes can be fatal. Over time, it reshapes how you see the world and how you see yourself within it. When the end of the series eventually came, the explanation sounded reasonable, even elegant. The list had been completed. The major mysteries had been explored. It was the right time to stop. For many fans, that answer was enough. But there was something restrained in the way Wade spoke about it, a sense that the truth was layered, that the decision was not born from triumph, but from recognition. Recognition that continuing down the same path would require compromises he was no longer willing to make. Silence followed the final episodes. Years passed without a full accounting of what River Monsters had taken, not just given. During that silence, the image of fearless exploration remained intact. While the deeper cost stayed hidden beneath the surface, much like the creatures the show once pursued. And when Jeremy Wade finally began to speak more openly, it became clear that the end of River Monsters was not a single decision, but the culmination of many quiet realizations, each one heavier than the last. Long before television cameras followed him into the water, Jeremy Wade lived a life shaped by patience and solitude. He was not raised to become a performer, nor did he chase the idea of fame. His early years were defined by curiosity rather than spectacle. Rivers fascinated him not because they were dangerous, but because they were alive, unpredictable systems that carried stories older than any written record. While others saw rivers as boundaries or resources, he saw them as living archives, places where biology, culture, and human fear intersected. For nearly 2 decades, Wade worked as a biology teacher, a profession that demanded structure and discipline. During school terms, he taught students about ecosystems, adaptation, and survival. During breaks, he disappeared. He traveled alone or with minimal support, moving through regions most people only encountered on maps. These journeys were not glamorous. They involved unreliable transport, language barriers, and long periods of waiting. He listened more than he spoke, recording local accounts of unexplained incidents, injuries, and disappearances linked to rivers. Many of these stories were dismissed by outsiders as superstition. Wade treated them differently. He believed that fear often has a biological origin, even when wrapped in myth. Those early years forged habits that would later define his on-screen presence. He learned to observe quietly, to avoid drawing attention to himself, and to earn trust slowly. He understood that rivers demanded respect, not dominance. This mindset separated him from traditional adventurers. He was not chasing conquest. He was chasing understanding. But that pursuit came with isolation. Long stretches away from family and familiarity became normal. Airports, small boats, and temporary shelters replaced any sense of routine. Over time, movement itself became a form of stability. When illness struck during one of his expeditions, it forced a rare pause. Confined to recovery, Wade had time to reflect on the hundreds of stories he had collected. Patterns began to emerge. Similar creatures described in distant countries. Similar injuries reported in places with no contact between them. The idea for a television series was born not from a desire to entertain, but from a need to test these stories systematically. He wanted to apply scientific rigor to folklore, to see where exaggeration ended and reality began. The transition from independent researcher to television host was not seamless. Television required structure, deadlines, and an audience. Yet Wade insisted on maintaining control over tone and method. He resisted dramatization. He avoided scripts that exaggerated danger for effect. Each episode was built like an investigation, starting with testimony, followed by evidence, and ending with a conclusion grounded in biology. This approach earned trust, but it also created pressure. Viewers expected answers. Networks expected results. Rivers, however, do not operate on schedules. As River Monsters grew in popularity, Wade's life became increasingly defined by contrast. On screen, he appeared calm and methodical. Off-screen, his days were consumed by logistics, planning, and risk assessment. Success brought expansion. More locations, more extreme environments, more responsibility for crew safety. The margin for error narrowed with each season. What had once been a personal pursuit transformed into a large-scale operation, one where every decision carried weight beyond his own survival. The personal cost of this evolution was subtle but persistent. Relationships were difficult to maintain when months were spent in remote regions with limited communication. Home became an abstract concept rather than a physical place. Rest was something postponed, always scheduled for later, after the next expedition, the next episode, the next river. Wade rarely spoke publicly about this side of his life, but those close to him noted a growing seriousness, a quiet intensity that replaced earlier enthusiasm. There was also the burden of expectation. Audiences wanted bigger fish, more danger, more revelation. Wade understood the risk inherent in that demand. Pushing further meant entering more unstable regions, relying on less predictable infrastructure, and facing hazards that could not always be mitigated by experience. Each success raised the bar, not only for viewers but for himself. The question was no longer whether a mystery could be solved, but whether solving it was still justified. Meanwhile, the rivers continued to change. Years of travel gave Wade a long-term perspective few others possessed. He began noticing declines that could not be attributed to chance. Species once encountered with some regularity became difficult to locate. Local fishermen spoke less about monsters and more about scarcity. These observations did not fit neatly into the show's original premise, yet they could not be ignored. They added a layer of unease to his work, a sense that documenting these waters might soon become an act of mourning rather than discovery. By the time River Monsters reached its later seasons, Wade was carrying more than stories and equipment. He was carrying the weight of years spent witnessing slow, often invisible loss. The man audiences saw standing confidently in rushing water was the same man who lay awake questioning the long-term impact of his work. The foundation of his journey, built on curiosity and respect, was beginning to strain under the realities he could no longer separate from his own role. By the time River Monsters entered its later years, the tension that had been quietly accumulating beneath the surface began to break through. What once felt like a controlled investigation into freshwater legends was now shadowed by a series of events that reshaped Jeremy Wade's relationship with the show and with the rivers themselves. These were not isolated incidents or dramatic turning points captured neatly on camera. They were fragments of strain, danger, and doubt that slowly connected into a larger realization he could no longer ignore. The physical toll became harder to dismiss. Years of travel through extreme climates had left their mark. In tropical regions, heat pressed down relentlessly, turning long days into endurance tests. In colder environments, numbness crept in, dulling reaction times and increasing the risk of mistakes. Wade had always accepted discomfort as part of the job, but there is a threshold beyond which experience no longer guarantees safety. During several expeditions, he found himself calculating risk more carefully than before, aware that recovery took longer and injuries lingered in ways they once had not. There were moments that came frighteningly close to disaster. In fast-moving waters, a single misstep could mean being dragged under by unseen currents. Handling massive fish required precision and strength, and even a brief lapse could result in crushing blows or broken ribs. Wade spoke later about impacts that left him struggling to breathe, pain that followed him for weeks, reminders that the creatures he sought to understand were never truly controllable. These were not heroic scars. They were warnings. The danger extended beyond him. Crew members faced hazards that could not always be anticipated or controlled. Equipment malfunctioned in remote locations where replacements were impossible to obtain. Weather shifted suddenly, turning calm rivers into violent obstacles. On one occasion, a lightning strike narrowly missed turning a routine shoot into a fatal incident. The shock of it lingered long after filming resumed, leaving a quiet awareness that luck, not planning, had intervened. For a team accustomed to risk, that realization carried a different weight. Alongside the physical threats, emotional strain intensified. The rhythm of production allowed little time for reflection or recovery. Long days blurred together, punctuated by brief rests that never felt sufficient. Meals were hurried, sleep fragmented, and personal space almost non-existent. Wade began noticing changes not only in himself, but in those around him. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter became rare. Some longtime crew members chose to step away, citing exhaustion without elaboration. Their departures left gaps that could not easily be filled, increasing pressure on those who remained. At the same time, the creative core of the show faced its own crisis. River Monsters had built its reputation on authenticity. Each episode promised a real mystery, grounded in biology and local testimony. But after years of exploration, the number of truly unknown, ethically viable targets diminished. Revisiting locations became necessary, but repetition risked undermining the integrity that defined the series. Wade was acutely aware of this danger. Fabricating threats or exaggerating behavior for spectacle would betray everything the show stood for. Audience expectations complicated matters further. Viewers accustomed to constant escalation wanted each episode to surpass the last. Bigger fish, greater danger, more dramatic revelations. Wade understood that chasing novelty for its own sake could lead to misrepresentation or unnecessary risk. The pressure to deliver compelling television clashed increasingly with his responsibility as a scientist and storyteller. The question of how far was too far grew more urgent with each season. Behind the scenes, discussions with producers and network representatives reflected a shifting landscape. Budgets tightened. Schedules became less flexible. The unpredictability of remote filming, once tolerated as part of the show's appeal, was now scrutinized. Delays caused by weather, illness, or access issues translated into rising costs. The same qualities that made River Monsters distinctive also made it difficult to manage within an industry moving toward efficiency and predictability. Yet the most profound change came from the rivers themselves. Returning to locations visited years earlier, Wade encountered environments that felt altered beyond recognition. Waters once clear were now clouded with sediment and waste. Fish populations had declined noticeably. Local communities spoke less about fear and more about loss. These observations struck deeper than any near-death experience. They suggested that the monsters he had spent years pursuing were no longer the greatest threat facing these ecosystems. Wade began to grapple with an ethical dilemma he had not anticipated at the outset. Showcasing rare or endangered species to a global audience carried unintended consequences. Increased attention could attract illegal fishing or exploitation, placing further strain on already vulnerable populations. He questioned whether the excitement generated by discovery might inadvertently contribute to harm. This internal conflict intensified as conservation issues became impossible to separate from the stories he was telling. Safety concerns extended beyond natural hazards. Filming in politically unstable regions introduced risks that were rarely discussed publicly. Sudden unrest, restricted access, and unreliable emergency support added layers of uncertainty. Insurance providers raised questions. Restrictions were suggested that would fundamentally alter the way the show operated. Each new condition felt like a narrowing corridor, limiting what could be done safely and responsibly. As these factors converged, Wade found himself at a crossroads. Continuing the series meant accepting compromises he was increasingly uncomfortable with. Ending it meant letting go of a project that had defined a decade of his life and inspired countless viewers. The decision was not made in a single moment. It emerged slowly, shaped by accumulated experiences and quiet realizations. When the final season aired, the tone reflected this shift. There was introspection where there had once been bravado. A sense of closure replaced the thrill of pursuit. Publicly, the explanation focused on completion and natural conclusion. Privately, Wade carried a deeper understanding of why he needed to step away. River Monsters had reached a point where continuing would demand a denial of the very truths it had revealed. The silence that followed was deliberate. It took time for him to articulate what the show had taught him, not just about fish or rivers, but about limits. Limits of endurance. Limits of storytelling. Limits of exploration in a world where the greatest dangers were no longer hidden beneath the surface, but created by human hands. When the decision to end River Monsters settled into reality, its impact unfolded in ways that were far more complex than a simple farewell to a television series. The consequences rippled outward, affecting not only Jeremy Wade, but also the people who had built their lives around the production and the audiences who had quietly woven the show into their own routines. What appeared on the surface as a graceful conclusion masked a deeper sense of dislocation, a recognition that something enduring had come to an end before anyone was truly prepared for it. For Wade, the immediate aftermath brought an unfamiliar stillness. For years, his life had been governed by movement, deadlines, and the constant anticipation of the next expedition. Suddenly, there were no flights to book, no permits to secure, no rivers waiting on the horizon. This absence was not restful at first. It felt disorienting, even unsettling. Without the structure imposed by production schedules, he was left alone with memories that had once been compartmentalized by necessity. Injuries that had been ignored now demanded attention. Fatigue that had been postponed now surfaced fully. The body, no longer sustained by adrenaline and momentum, revealed the cumulative cost of years spent pushing against its limits. Emotionally, the shift was equally profound. River Monsters had provided more than a professional identity. It had been a lens through which Wade understood his purpose. Stepping away forced him to confront questions he had long deferred. Who was he without the hunt, without the investigation, without the constant confrontation with danger and mystery? The answer did not arrive quickly. It emerged gradually, through reflection rather than action. There was relief in no longer placing himself and others in harm's way, but there was also a quiet grief for the intensity that had once defined his days. The crew felt the loss in different ways. For many, the show had been a long-term commitment, a shared experience forged through hardship and trust. They had navigated remote regions together, relied on one another in moments of uncertainty, and built professional bonds that resembled family more than employment. When the series ended, those connections dispersed. Some moved on to safer, more predictable projects. Others found that few productions offered the same sense of purpose or challenge. The end of River Monsters was not just the end of a job. It was the end of a unique collective journey. Audiences, too, experienced a subtle sense of absence. For years, River Monsters had been a dependable presence, a reminder that there were still corners of the world governed by mystery rather than algorithms and schedules. Viewers had grown accustomed to the ritual of watching Wade enter unknown waters with quiet determination. The show offered a form of escape that felt grounded rather than fantastical. When it disappeared, that ritual vanished with it. Social media filled briefly with tributes and reflections, but as time passed, the deeper significance of the loss became harder to articulate. It was not simply about missing new episodes. It was about losing a particular way of seeing the natural world. In a broader context, the conclusion of the series coincided with a changing media landscape. Adventure-driven documentaries were becoming rarer, replaced by formats that favored control, predictability, and minimal risk. The end of River Monsters symbolized a shift away from productions willing to embrace uncertainty and physical danger in pursuit of authenticity. Its absence highlighted how unusual such a commitment had been and how difficult it was to sustain within evolving industry constraints. Perhaps the most significant consequence lay in the message the show left behind. As viewers revisited older episodes, patterns became more apparent. Rivers that once seemed abundant now appeared fragile. Species that were presented as formidable predators began to feel vulnerable in retrospect. What had once been framed as a confrontation between human and monster now read as a documentation of ecosystems under pressure. Without intending to, River Monsters had become a historical record of environments already changing by the time the final credits rolled. For Wade, this realization deepened his sense of responsibility. The show had captured moments that could not be recreated, not because of creative limitations, but because the conditions that made them possible were fading. This awareness reshaped how he viewed the years spent filming. The risks, the exhaustion, the sacrifices, they had all contributed to preserving a snapshot of the natural world at a particular moment in time. That legacy carried weight, both comforting and heavy. The end of River Monsters did not bring closure in the conventional sense. Instead, it opened a period of reckoning. Wade was no longer insulated by the demands of production. He could no longer separate observation from consequence. The rivers he had explored continued to change, whether or not cameras were present. The stories he had once told for discovery now demanded continuation in another form, one that addressed loss rather than mystery. This transition marked a turning point. The consequences of ending the show extended beyond the absence of new episodes. They altered Wade's trajectory, the careers of those who worked alongside him, and the expectations of audiences who had followed the journey for a decade. River Monsters ended, but its impact did not fade. It lingered as a reminder that exploration leaves traces, not only on maps and film, but on the people who undertake it and the environments they reveal. Away from the cameras and the carefully edited narratives, there were quieter stories that never found their way into an episode. These were moments that did not fit the structure of mystery and resolution, yet they carried a different kind of truth. They unfolded in between expeditions, during long journeys, and in the silences that followed particularly difficult shoots. Over time, these unspoken experiences accumulated, shaping Jeremy Wade's understanding of what river monsters had truly become. There were evenings when he sat alone, replaying conversations with local fishermen long after the crew had packed up for the night. Some of these men spoke not with fear, but with resignation. They described rivers that once fed entire villages, now reduced to unpredictable flows. Their stories were less about monsters and more about absence. These conversations rarely made it on screen because they lacked a clear antagonist. They pointed instead to slow change, to causes that were too complex and too uncomfortable to resolve within a single episode. Wade carried these encounters with him, recording observations in personal notes rather than field reports. He noticed how often people spoke of the past in tones of mourning. The monsters of legend had once symbolized danger, but now they symbolized abundance, proof that the river was alive and powerful. In some regions, fear had been replaced by concern. The question was no longer what lurked beneath the surface, but whether anything still did. There were also private moments of doubt that Wade rarely acknowledged publicly. After particularly intense expeditions, he questioned the ethics of exposure. A location featured on television could attract attention beyond tourism. Word traveled quickly. Rare species, once known only to local communities, suddenly became objects of curiosity for outsiders. While awareness could inspire protection, it could also invite exploitation. Wade wrestled with the possibility that telling these stories, however responsibly, might carry unintended consequences. This concern deepened as conservation issues became more urgent. In some cases, Wade chose to limit what was shown or said on screen. Certain details were deliberately omitted, not out of secrecy, but out of caution. The line between education and endangerment grew thinner with each passing year. The responsibility weighed heavily, especially as he recognized his own influence. Millions watched his work. What he highlighted mattered. The emotional cost of these decisions was compounded by isolation. Despite working with a crew, Wade often felt alone in carrying the moral weight of the series. Crew members focused on logistics, safety, and production demands. Network executives focused on schedules and ratings. Few shared his long-term perspective, shaped by decades of returning to the same rivers and witnessing their decline. The burden of interpretation fell largely on him. There were personal sacrifices as well. Birthdays missed, relationships strained by long absences, a sense of time slipping by unnoticed. While the public saw a life of adventure, the reality was a series of trade-offs. Each expedition meant choosing work over familiarity, purpose over comfort. These choices accumulated quietly, leaving behind questions about what had been given up in the process. As River Monsters progressed, Wade became increasingly aware of the emotional disconnect between audience perception and lived experience. Viewers saw resolution where he saw ongoing loss. A successful capture on screen could coincide with knowledge that the species was declining rapidly. The triumph felt hollow when placed against the broader context. This dissonance became harder to reconcile. It suggested that the show's format, while effective for storytelling, could not fully contain the truth he was encountering. Conversations with close collaborators occasionally touched on these tensions, but rarely in depth. There was an unspoken understanding that certain thoughts were too heavy to voice in the middle of production. Momentum carried the project forward, even as underlying questions remained unresolved. Wade learned to compartmentalize, to set aside doubt long enough to complete the work at hand. But compartmentalization has limits. Eventually, the walls begin to crack. In the years following the end of the series, these quieter stories began to surface in reflection rather than confession. Wade spoke less about individual monsters and more about systems, connections, and consequences. The emphasis shifted from discovery to responsibility. The experiences that once felt peripheral now appeared central. They explained why the end of River Monsters felt necessary, even inevitable. These unshared moments formed the emotional core of the decision to step away. They were not dramatic enough for headlines, yet they carried more weight than any near-death encounter. They revealed a man grappling with the impact of his own success, questioning how to balance storytelling with stewardship. In that tension lay the true legacy of River Monsters, not as a catalog of creatures caught and released, but as a chronicle of a changing world seen through the eyes of someone who stayed long enough to notice the difference. With distance came clarity. Once the urgency of production faded and the rhythm of constant travel stopped, Jeremy Wade began to understand the full shape of what River Monsters had been, not just to audiences, but to himself. What started as an investigation into freshwater legends had evolved into something far more complex. It had become a record of human curiosity colliding with natural limits, and of a man slowly realizing that exploration carries responsibilities that extend beyond discovery. The legacy of the series could not be measured solely by ratings or memorable episodes. Its true weight lay in what it captured unintentionally. Over a decade, River Monsters documented rivers at a moment in history when many were already under pressure but had not yet reached visible collapse. In hindsight, those images became fragments of a vanishing baseline. Fish once portrayed as fearsome giants now seemed like fragile survivors. The monsters, once the focus of attention, faded into symbols of ecosystems that were quietly unraveling. For Wade, this realization reshaped how he viewed his own achievements. Pride in the work was inseparable from unease. He had reached places few outsiders ever would. He had listened to voices rarely amplified. He had approached myths with respect and science. Yet alongside these accomplishments came the understanding that witnessing decline does not equate to preventing it. Observation alone was no longer enough. The question that lingered was whether continuing to frame rivers as arenas of danger and mystery still served the truth he had come to know. There was also a more personal reckoning. Years spent chasing the unknown had defined Wade's identity. Stepping away forced him to confront the quieter aspects of life he had postponed. Stillness, once an inconvenience, became a necessity. Reflection replaced momentum. In that space, he acknowledged the toll of constant risk and the normalization of danger. Survival had always been treated as part of the job, but survival is not a sustainable metric for a life's work. The contrast between past and present became stark. Where earlier seasons emphasized confrontation, later reflections emphasized connection. Wade no longer spoke primarily about what lurked beneath the surface, but about what connected rivers to the people who depended on them. He recognized that fear had been an entry point, not an end goal. It drew attention, created urgency, and invited curiosity. But fear alone could not sustain care. Understanding required context, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. River Monsters, in this light, became a transitional chapter. It bridged an era when nature documentaries thrived on spectacle with one increasingly defined by accountability. The show's success opened doors, but it also revealed the limitations of storytelling built around singular threats. The greatest dangers to rivers were not predators with teeth or tails. They were diffuse, systemic forces that could not be reeled in, measured, or released. Pollution, over-extraction, and fragmentation lacked the drama of a physical encounter. Yet their impact was far more profound. Wade's legacy, therefore, was not simply that of a man who chased monsters. It was that of someone who recognized when the story needed a change. Walking away was not an act of retreat, but of recalibration. It signaled a shift from proving what existed to questioning what might be lost. In choosing to step back, he preserved the integrity of the work rather than stretching it beyond its ethical limits. The lessons embedded in River Monsters extended beyond conservation. They spoke to the limits of endurance, the cost of obsession, and the importance of knowing when to stop. In a culture that often celebrates relentless pursuit, Wade's decision offered counterpoint. Completion did not require exhaustion to the point of collapse. Success did not demand denial of consequence. There was dignity in acknowledging that some journeys reach a point where continuation undermines their original purpose. As audiences revisited the series with this perspective, its meaning shifted. What once felt like triumphs now carried an undercurrent of warning. The rivers on screen were not timeless backdrops. They were living systems already under strain. The legacy of River Monsters lay in revealing that tension, even if unintentionally. It left viewers with a deeper, more complicated appreciation of the waters that sustain life and the responsibility that comes with drawing stories from them. In the end, the most enduring inheritance of the series was not fear or fascination, but awareness. Awareness that exploration changes both the explorer and the explored. Awareness that silence, when chosen deliberately, can be as meaningful as revelation. An awareness that legacy is defined not only by what is achieved, but by what one chooses not to pursue any further. When the journey finally reached its quiet conclusion, there was no dramatic farewell, no grand announcement to mark the end of River Monsters. Instead, what remained was a lingering sense of absence, a silence that felt heavier precisely because it arrived without spectacle. The rivers were still there, flowing as they always had, yet something essential had shifted. The man who once entered those waters in search of hidden giants had stepped back, leaving behind questions that no longer belonged to a single series or a single lifetime. Looking back, the story of River Monsters reads differently than it once did. What appeared to be a chronicle of fearless exploration now feels like a gradual awakening. Each expedition added another layer of understanding, not only about freshwater species, but about the fragile balance that sustains them. The monsters that once dominated the narrative became secondary to the environments that shaped them. In that reversal lies the true ending of the journey, one defined less by resolution than by recognition. For viewers, the end of the series marked the loss of a familiar ritual. Seasons had passed with the expectation that another river, another mystery, would soon follow. Without that promise, audiences were left to sit with what the show had already revealed. Many revisited old episodes and noticed details that had once been overlooked. The absence of certain species, the subtle warnings voiced by local communities, the moments when curiosity edged into concern. These fragments, when viewed together, formed a quiet epilogue that extended beyond the final broadcast. Jeremy Wade's decision to step away invited reflection rather than closure. It asked viewers to consider what it means to witness decline without immediately naming it. The show had offered adventure, but it had also offered access. Access to places rarely seen, to voices rarely heard, and to realities often ignored. In doing so, it placed responsibility not only on the storyteller, but on the audience. Watching was no longer a passive act. It carried implications. The legacy of River Monsters does not rest in a single explanation for why it ended. It lives in the accumulation of truths it uncovered along the way. Truths about endurance and limits, about the cost of turning danger into entertainment, about the thin line between discovery and disturbance. These lessons resonate beyond the context of television. They speak to a broader moment in which humanity is forced to confront the consequences of its own curiosity. There's a temptation to reduce the end of the series to a simple reason: to say the monsters were gone, to say the risks were too high, to say the network moved on. But such explanations flatten a story that was anything but simple. River Monsters ended not because one factor outweighed all others, but because many pressures converged, each reinforcing the realization that continuing would compromise the values that made the journey meaningful in the first place. In stepping back, Wade did not abandon the rivers. He changed how he engaged with them. His later work shifted attention from confrontation to context, from singular creatures to interconnected systems. This evolution was not a rejection of the past, but a response to it. The questions he now asked were larger, less cinematic, and more urgent. They reflected a world in which the greatest threats are often invisible until it is too late. The story closes not with certainty, but with an invitation. An invitation to look at rivers not as stages for danger, but as lifelines under strain. An invitation to reconsider what draws us to stories of fear and wonder, and what responsibility follows that fascination. River Monsters may have ended, but the issues it illuminated did not. They continue to flow, unresolved, demanding attention beyond the confines of a television screen. In the end, perhaps the most powerful legacy of the series lies in what it leaves unsaid, in the choice to stop rather than to overextend, in the willingness to let silence speak where spectacle once dominated. That silence asks a question each viewer must answer for themselves. Not about what monster lives beneath the surface, but about what kind of world we are willing to leave beneath the waterline once the cameras are gone.